Every new relationship begins with possibility. A first date becomes a second. Conversations get longer. You begin sharing parts of yourself that you don't share with everyone. And somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, a quiet question begins forming in the back of your mind. Could this be my person? Most of us answer the question using the information that easiest to see: chemistry, conversations, shared interest, the excitement of feeling understood. And while those things matter, they are only part of the picture because almost every relationship looks its best in the beginning. When both people are excited, when everyone is making an effort, when every little thing has been tasted. The challenge isn't deciding whether someone is interesting. The challenge is knowing which moments actually tell you something meaningful about who they are and about the relationship you are building together. Because every relationship eventually tells you the truth, not all at once, and rarely through grand gestures. It tells you the truth in ordinary moments, in disappointment, in disagreement, in unmet expectations, in the small situation most people overlook. The problem is that many of us make important decisions before those moments have had a chance to happen. Today isn't about becoming more suspicious, and it isn't about judging people more harshly. It's about learning where relationships reveal the information that actually matters. Because the better you become at recognizing those moments, the less you'll have to rely on guesswork. And the more confident you become, you will know if what you are trying to build has the foundation to last. Welcome to Love Hacks. Hi everyone, welcome back to Love Hacks. I'm Mikaela, and today we are going to talk about the biggest misconceptions about dating. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that we do is that we believe compatibility is something that we discover. Almost as if we were trying to find the right person hidden somewhere in the world. But I don't think that's how it really works in relationships. Compatibility isn't something that you can just discover at once. It's something that it's revealed over time. Because when people describe why they fell in love, they usually talk about the beginning. We talk for hours, you know, or they say something like, we had incredible chemistry, or I felt like I've never known someone like this before. And I'm going to say that those are wonderful experiences, but they are not the moments that tell you whether two people can actually build a life together. Those moments tell you how the relationship feels. They don't necessarily tell you how the relationship functions, and those are two very different things. Think about this. The first few weeks of dating happen under almost the perfect conditions. Both people are trying, both people are excited, both people are actually paying attention. Life hasn't interrupted anything yet. Very few expectations exist. Very few disappointments have happened. So, of course, everything feels easier. The real formation usually appears later, not because people suddenly change, but because everyday life finally gives the relationship something to respond to. And that's why instead of asking, how do I know if this is the right person, we should ask something much more useful. Like, for example, what experiences has this relationship actually gone through? Because some questions simply can be answered in the beginning. You don't know how someone handles disappointment. You don't know how they respond when plans changes. You don't know what happens when the two of you have a disagreement. Those answers only arrive with time. And unfortunately, many of us make an important emotional decision before we have collected all the information. That's why this is so important. The first place where relationships begin revealing themselves is around boundaries. Not because boundaries create problems, but because boundaries reveal how two people handle having different needs. Imagine you've been seeing someone for a few weeks. Things are going very well. And one evening they ask if you'd like to stay over. And you simply respond, you know, I'd rather head home tonight. And that's it. No argument, no rejection, just a preference. At first glance, it seems like a very ordinary moment, but it's actually one of the first opportunities to learn something meaningful about the relationship. Because what happens next isn't really about staying over. It's about whether two people can want different things without turning that difference into a problem. A healthy response might be, I was hoping you'd stay, but I understand. There's disappointment, but there's also respect. Both people are allowed to want different things. Neither person has to lose. That's what a healthy boundary often look like. Not agreement, respect. Now imagine a different response. I guess I know how you feel about me. Or I thought we were closer than that. Nothing explosive, nothing absolutely dramatic. But I want you to notice something. Something is happening in a very quietly way. The conversation has shifted away from your decision and toward making you responsible for how someone else actually feels. And suddenly, you may find yourself explaining, apologizing, wondering if you did something wrong, even though all you really did was answer honestly. One of the biggest misconceptions about boundaries is that people think that they are designed to create distance. But in reality, healthy boundaries create clarity. They allow people to understand each other without asking either person to stop being themselves. And that's why boundaries aren't really tests, they are opportunities. Opportunities to learn how someone responds when life doesn't go exactly the way they hoped. Because usually every relationship reaches those moments. One person wants to spend the weekend together, but the other person already have plans. One person wants to talk, the other needs space. One person is ready for the next step, the other isn't there yet. Those differences aren't the problem because these problems are going to appear and are going to happen. They are inevitable. The real question is what happens next? Think about that for a moment. Every long term relationship is built by two different people, two different personalities, two different histories, two different ways to solving problems. If both people have to agree on everything all the time, the healthy relationship will never exist. The goal has never been constant agreement. The goal is to learn how to stay connected while respecting each other's individuality. That's a very different skill. One of the healthiest signs in the relationship isn't hearing someone say, "We are exactly the same." It's hearing, "We are different," and that's okay. Because respect doesn't require sameness, it requires a room for another person's opinions, their preferences, their friendships, their routine, their independence, and perhaps most importantly, their ability to say no without worrying if that relationship will suddenly become unstable. One question I think it's incredibly useful is this: can I disagree with the person without feeling guilty for having a different need? Notice that we are not asking whether they always like your answer. Nobody enjoys disappointment. Healthy people feel disappointed too. The difference is that disappointment doesn't become pressure. It doesn't become guilt. It doesn't become punishment. It simply becomes another moment that two people navigate together. And that's emotional maturity. And this matters because relationships don't become unhealthy all at once. They become unhealthy one small judgment at the time. Maybe you stop mentioning certain friends because it's easier. Maybe you stop experiencing certain opinions because you don't want another conversation. Maybe you begin checking your phone more often because you know someone gets anxious if you don't respond immediately. Each change seems insignificant by itself. You tell yourself, it's easier this way. It's not worth arguing about this. But relationships aren't shaped by one decision, they are shaped by hundreds of small decisions. And sometimes those decisions slowly begin changing who you are. And that's why you should pay attention to something very simple. As this relationship grows, is my world becoming bigger or smaller? Am I still investing in my relationship, my interest, my goals, my family? Do I still feel like myself? Or am I quietly reorganizing myself around keeping this relationship comfortable? Healthy relationships usually expand your life. They introduce new experiences, new perspectives, new opportunities. They don't require to slowly give pieces of yourself away just to maintain the harmony of the relationship. And I think that's such an important distinction because we are not talking about sacrifice. Every healthy relationship asks us to be thoughtful, flexible, generous. That's a big part of loving another person. But compromise is something two people choose together. Self abandonment is something one person quietly does alone. Those are not the same thing. So perhaps the first lesson isn't, can this person respect my boundaries? It's actually something a little bigger. Can this relationship make room for two complete different people? Because that's what healthy love eventually becomes. Not two people disappearing in each other, but two people learning how to grow alongside one another. And that's one of the first places where a relationship begins revealing the truth. Not during the exciting moments during the ordinary moments when two people discover whether respect is stronger than preferences. The second place where relationships reveal themselves is disagreement. Not because disagreement is a sign that something is wrong, quite the opposite. Disagreement is one of the most normal experiences in a relationship. The question isn't whether you will disagree. The question is what disagreement teaches you about the two of you. Imagine telling your partner, when you canceled dinner without letting me know, I felt hurt. It's a simple sentence. You are not attacking them. You are not questioning their character. You are simply sharing your experience. What happened next often tells you far more than the original mistake ever could. But maybe not for the reason most people think. Most of us assume that very difficult conversation is about solving a problem. And I don't think it is. I think every difficult conversation leaves something behind. Sometimes it leaves more confidence, sometimes a little less, sometimes it makes the relationship easier to turn to, sometimes it makes both people think, next time, maybe I'll just let it go. That's the part we rarely notice. Relationships don't change because of one conversation. They change because every conversation leaves a trace. A little more openness, a little more hesitation, a little more trust, a little more distance. None of those changes are dramatic. In fact, they are almost invisible while they are happening. But over time, they become the emotional climate of the relationship. And that climate influences everything. Whether people speak honestly, whether they hide disappointment, whether they bring problems into the open or quietly carry them alone, maybe that's why no relationship suddenly becomes disconnected. It slowly becomes a place where certain conversations stop feeling impossible. And the opposite is also true. The strongest relationships aren't the ones that avoid difficult moments. They are the ones where difficult moments never become dangerous to the relationship itself. Think about that for a second. No relationship stays exactly the same. Every conversation moves in one direction or another. Maybe some conversations makes it easier to be open to the next time. Others make people think twice before saying what they really feel. And those moments matter more than we actually realized. Not because any single conversation changed everything, but because they slowly influence how two people begin responding to each other. Over time, couples settle into patterns. Some become better at returning to difficult conversations. Others become better at avoiding them, and some learn that honesty brings them closer. And others slowly decide that certain subjects simply aren't worth bringing up anymore. None of that usually happens on purpose. It happens gradually, one conversation at the time, one experience at the time. And that's why it is worthy to ask a different question. Not who was right or even did we solve this, but what direction is the relationship moving in? Because relationships aren't shaped by one great conversation or one difficult one. They are shaped by the direction those conversations create over time. And sometimes the biggest change in a relationship aren't the ones you notice immediately. They are the ones you only recognize months later when you realize the relationship doesn't feel quite the same anymore. And sometimes that's for the better. You notice you are more patient with each other, more honest, more relaxed. You recover from misunderstandings more quickly than you used to. Not because either of you become perfect, but because the relationship kept adapting. And other times, the opposite happens. Conversations become shorter. Certain topics quietly disappear. You start thinking, it's probably not worth bringing it up. Not because you stop caring, but because experiences has taught you how those conversations usually end. And that's when something important begins to change. Not necessarily the love you feel for this person, but the freedom to be fully yourself within the relationship. And I think that's something we rarely talk about. We often ask whether a relationship makes us happy, but maybe another question matters just as much. Does this relationship make it easier or harder to be yourself? Because the healthiest relationships don't just survive over time, they create more room for both of you and more room to grow with each other. You learn how to speak honestly, to change your minds, to make different mistakes, and how to make mistakes. You keep learning about each other instead of assuming they've already figured it out. Or maybe that's why lasting relationships never really stop evolving. They don't reach a point where everything is finally solved. They simply keep adjusting as life changes around them. And perhaps that's the goal that we need to understand in our relationships. Not to build a relationship that never changes, but to build one that knows how to change well. One of the things that surprised me the most when I started paying attention to long lasting relationships was realizing they don't spend their lives trying to avoid mistakes. They spend their lives becoming better at recovering from them. Those are two different goals. If your goal is to never disappoint each other, you are setting the relationship up for something impossible because life gets busy, people get tired, stress changes us. Sometimes we forget things, sometimes we get things wrong, sometimes we simply don't show up as the version of ourselves we hope to be. That's part of sharing a life with another human being. The question is never whether those moments will happen. The question is what the relationship does with them. Because every setback creates an opportunity, not just to solve what happened, but to understand each other a little better than you did before. I've always believed that relationships become stronger in very quiet ways, not through dramatic declarations, not through grand romantic gestures, but through hundreds of moments where two people slowly become easier to understand, easier to trust, and easier to come back to after life gets messy. That's what makes a relationship feel solid, not perfection. I don't think perfection is the right way to try to have a relationship. The quiet confidence that even when things don't go as planned, the relationship knows how to find its way back. And maybe that's something we don't appreciate enough. We are often looking for certainty, for guarantees, for reassurance that nothing will ever go wrong. But maybe confidence in a relationship doesn't come from believing nothing will happen. Maybe it comes from believing that whatever might happen. The two of you won't stop working as a team because that's what time it's really testing. Not whether your relationship can avoid challenges, but whether it becomes better equipped to meet them together. I also think we put too much pressure on individual moments. We treat them as if every disagreement is a final verdict of a relationship, as if every difficult week means something is fundamentally wrong. But relationships don't usually change because one conversation. They change because of what happens over the months that follows. Do people become more patient with each other, more understanding, more willing to adjust? Or do they slowly become more guarded, more frustrated, more convinced that nothing is ever going to change? Those are a very different journeys, and they don't happen overnight. They happen gradually. Sometimes you don't even notice them while they are happening. Then one day you look back and realize your relationship feels completely different from the one you had a year ago. Not because one dramatic event changed everything, but because dozens of ordinary moments quietly moved you in the same direction. That's why I think one of the most healthiest questions we can ask ourselves from time to time is simply, are we becoming a better team? Not, are we perfect? Not, do we still argue? But, are we handling life better together than we were 6 months ago? Because if the answer is yes, that's growth. Growth isn't measured by how rarely life changes you. It's measured by how differently you respond to those challenges than you did before. I think that's one of the most hopeful things about relationships. They are not fixed, they are not finished. They aren't something you either get right or get wrong in the beginning. They are always becoming something, always changing, always giving two people another opportunity to build something a little bit stronger than they had yesterday. And maybe that's why lasting relationships don't feel effortless. They feel lived in, they feel flexible. They make room for change because the people inside them understand something very important. The goal was never to avoid every storm. The goal was to become better at navigating them together. And I also think that that's why we sometimes become discouraged so quickly. We expect every meaningful conversation to change everything overnight, but that's rarely how it works. Real change is usually much quieter than that. You notice that a conversation that used to end in frustration now ends with a little more understanding. A disagreement that once lasted 3 days now lasts 30 minutes. A subject that used to feel impossible to talk about slowly become easier. Those aren't dramatic victories, but they are signs that the relationship is becoming more resilient. And resilience is one of the qualities people rarely notice until they need it. It's easy to appreciate chemistry. It's easy to appreciate attraction. It's easy to appreciate excitement. But resilience is different. You only recognize its value when life becomes complicated, when work is stressful, when health changes, when children arrive, when families get involved, when expectation shifts. That's when you discover whether the relationship can bend without breaking. I've always thought that's a much more useful way to think a long term love. Not as finding someone who is perfectly compatible with you from the beginning, but as building something that becomes more capable over time. Because life doesn't stop changing, and neither do we. The people we are today won't be exactly the same people 5 years from now. We'll have different experiences, different priorities, different challenges. The question is whether the relationship keeps growing alongside those changes or quietly gets left behind by them. And maybe that's why the strongest couples aren't the ones who never have to adapt. They are the ones who never stop adapting. Not because adaptation is easy, but because they understand that every stage of life asks something different from the relationship. And every stage gives the relationship another opportunity to grow. Maybe that's why we sometimes expect the wrong things from love. We expect certainty, we expect guarantees, we expect to reach a point where everything finally comes easy. But perhaps that's never been the goal. Maybe the goal is something much simpler, to build a relationship that is capable of growing through different seasons of life. Because no 2 years look exactly the same. The relationship you have in your 20s won't be the same relationship you will have in your 40s. The relationship you have before children won't be the same after children. The relationship you have before loss won't be the one you have after grief. Life keeps changing, and every change asks the relationship a new question. Not, do you still love each other? But can you continue growing together? I think that it is a much more hopeful way to think about love because it takes the pressure off perfection. It reminds us that relationships aren't successful because they never need to adapt. They are successful because they keep adapting without losing sight of each other. Sometimes that means having conversations you've never had before. Sometimes it means letting go of habits that no longer work. Sometimes it means learning how to support each other in completely new ways. And none of that happens automatically. It happens because two people remain willing to keep discovering one another. Even after years together, even after routine settles in already, even after life becomes busy. Maybe that's one of the greatest challenges in a long term relationship. Not staying together, but continuing to remain curious about the person who is growing right beside you. Because the moment we assume we already know everything about each other, the relationship stops exploring. And when a relationship stops exploring, it often stops growing. Perhaps that's why the healthiest long term relationships don't feel finished. Maybe it's because they still make room for questions, for change, for surprises, for new conversation. Not because the people are different every day, but because life is. And relationships that continue making room for life are the ones that keep moving forward. One of the biggest surprises about long term relationship is realizing that the relationship itself never stops changing. We sometimes imagine that if we found the right person, everything should eventually settle into place. And we thought the goal is to reach a point where nothing really changes anymore. But that's never how it works. And that's not how life works. Life keeps moving. And every time life changes, the relationship changes with it. The people you are today won't be exactly the same people 5 years from now. You'll have different priorities, different responsibilities, different worries, different dreams. The question isn't whether you'll change, because you will. The question is whether the relationship keeps making room for those changes. Because every new chapter asks something different of two people. Starting a new job, moving, losing someone you love, becoming a parent, watching children grow up, facing illness, planning retirement. None of those moments simply change our lives. They also change what the relationship needs. Sometimes it needs more patience, sometimes more flexibility, sometimes more laughter, sometimes simply more grace.
Looking for real conversations about love, connection, and everything in between? Listen to Love Hacks. Honest, heartfelt, and in four languages: English, Espanol, Francais, and Portuguese. Find your version wherever you get your podcast. See you soon.
I've always thought that one of the most beautiful things about relationships are that they are never finished. They never reach the point where there's nothing left to discover. Because the person sitting across from you today won't be exactly the same person sitting across from you 10 years from now. Hopefully, they will be wiser, more experienced, changed by everything life has given them. And hopefully, so will you. Maybe that's why curiosity is one of the greatest gifts we can offer each other. Not curiosity about what someone liked 20 years ago, but curiosity about who they are becoming today. Because relationships don't stop growing when people stop loving each other. Sometimes they stop growing when people stop discovering each other. When assumption replace questions, when routines replace curiosity, when we begin relating more to who someone used to be than to who they are becoming. I don't think love asks us to remain the same. I think it asks us to keep meeting each other again through every new season of life. And maybe that's what makes long term love so different from the beginning. At the beginning, you are discovering someone you never know before. Years later, you are discovering someone you know for a very long time, who is no longer exactly the same person. There's something beautiful about that because it reminds us that relationship isn't something you finish building. It's something you keep renovating. Not because it was broken, but because life keeps changing the people who live inside it. Maybe that's why happiest couples don't spend their lives trying to recreate the excitement they felt at the beginning. They don't expect every season to feel the same. Instead, they learn to appreciate what each season has to offer. The excitement of something new, the comfort of familiarity, the confidence that comes from sharing history, the resilience that only comes from overcoming difficult moments together. Each stage offers something different, and each stage asks for something different in return. I've always believed that one of the greatest strengths in relationships is flexibility, not changing who you are, but remaining open to discovering new ways of loving the same person. Because love isn't static, it responds to life, it responds to change, it responds to everything two people experience together over the years. Perhaps that's why some relationship seems to become richer with time, not because they avoided change, but because they welcome it instead of resisting it. They understood that growing older together also means growing differently together. And maybe that's one of the quietest definitions of commitment. Not promising that nothing will ever change, but promising not to stop learning how to love each other as it does. There's another reason I think this matters. When people talk about lasting relationships, they often focus on longevity. How many years they've been together, how many anniversaries they've celebrated. But time by itself doesn't tell us much. The people can spend decades together without ever really growing together. And another couple can spend far fewer years together. And yet, they build a partnership that continues to become stronger with each season passing. Time isn't what transforms a relationship. What people choose to do with that time does. And that is an important distinction. Because relationships don't become stronger automatically. They become stronger through thousands of small decisions that rarely feel significant in the moment. Choosing to stay curious instead of making assumptions. Choosing to ask instead of guessing. Choosing to make space for a conversation instead of postponing it until resentment quietly takes its place. Those choices don't usually feel extraordinary. In fact, they often feel ordinary. But perhaps that's exactly the point. The most important parts of a relationship are rarely dramatic. They are found in ordinary days, the days no one remembers, the conversations no one tells their friends about, the quiet moments that slowly shape the way two people experience life together. Maybe that's why relationships are less like photographs and much more like gardens. A photograph captures one perfect moment. A garden, it's something you return to. You notice what is growing, you notice what needs attention. You accept that every season looks a little bit different from the one before it. And you understand that caring for it isn't something you finish. It's something you continue doing. Not because something is wrong, but because that's simply how living things are staying alive. Perhaps a relationship are much the same. They are not projects to complete. They are something we continue caring for as life keeps unfolding around us. And maybe that's why the strongest relationships don't simply survive change, because they learn how to make change part of the story they are building together. So maybe the question was never, is this relationship perfect? Or even, will we ever stop facing challenges? Because no relationship does. Maybe the better question is this relationship continuing to grow with the people inside it? Because that's what the time is really revealing. Not whether two people still love each other, but whether they've continued making room from who each other is becoming. Love isn't frozen in the moment two people meet. It has to keep finding new ways to exist as life changes around it. And maybe that's why the strongest relationships don't feel finished. They don't reach a point where there's nothing left to learn, nothing left to discover, nothing left to understand. Instead, they remained open, open to new conversations, open to new chapters, open to become something even stronger that they were before. Perhaps that's what commitment really looks like. Not holding on to the past, but continuing to build future together. One conversation, one adjustment, one season at the time. Because in the end, lasting relationships aren't built by avoiding change. They are built by learning how to grow through it. Thank you for spending this time with us. If today's conversation resonated with you, we'd love for you to share this episode with someone who might need it to hear. And if you are enjoying Love Hacks, don't forget to follow the show whether you listen your podcast, and please leave us a review. It really helps us to continue this conversation and finding the way to reach more people and to help more people in a very healthier and stronger way. And we hoped that we are actually helping you to find a meaningful relationship and the love of your life. Remember that you need to keep talking and you need to keep growing, because a great relationship isn't something that you find, it's something that two people continue creating one season at a time. Have a nice week. Until next time. Bye. If this episode resonated with you, make sure to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.